I'm going to ask 4 men to come to the platform: Mark Thomas, Dave Anderson, Jeff McCreary, and Dan Moran. And these gentlemen all had an impact on Ian's life, but I think Ian had more impact on their lives, if you'd ask them. That's how Ian was. You cannot be around him without him impacting your life to some tremendous degree. Gentlemen.
I met Ian McCloskey several times, numerous times. He liked to talk. And much of his talk was about life and about death. I don't think I ever had to settle for small talk with Ian. Death was always closer to him than it was to many of us because of his condition and the prognosis that he had. And like the rest of us, you could tell that he feared dying, particularly at a young age. A battle has been waged these last 6 to 7 months, and throughout that time, I believed it was a battle for Ian's physical life. But now I know that that wasn't the battle. If that was the battle, we would have won. Greater is Jesus Christ in us than he who is in the world. So that could not have been the battle. No, the battle was for Ian's spiritual life and also his fear of dying. I had the opportunity to be in Ian's hospital room 2 or 3 weeks ago. And at that time, it was a great time of prayer. And you, if you were present in that room, you knew that the Holy Spirit was also present. And many of us prayed together and prayed for Ian. But Ian also prayed. And he prayed for us. He prayed for those of us who were present. He prayed for our families. And he also prayed for his own healing. But he confessed in that prayer that his faith in Jesus Christ was not dependent upon whether or not Christ healed him. He confessed that he loved Christ and he believed in Christ no matter what happened. So when it comes to battles that were fought, Ian did not lose the battle for his spiritual life. How many times would he have heard during these last 6, 7 months from Satan, Jesus isn't going to save you. You weren't good enough. That's the way Satan works. He accuses us. And I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to be lying there in the hospital with all your family and people coming and praying for you and the thoughts that would have gone through his mind. But in the end, I realized when Ian prayed for us and when he didn't base his love of Jesus Christ upon whether or not Christ would save him. He based it upon the fact that he had come to know Christ. He knew who he was. And he knew that no matter what happened, he was going to be with Christ for all eternity. So he is with Christ right now in the kingdom of heaven. And the greatest battle that each of us has in our lives, the battle for our souls, for our spirits, Ian won that battle. And it is a great victory for him and for his family.
Ian McCloskey was a complicated individual. Many of you are here. I'm sure you knew him well and knew that he was complex. And there's an old slogan that says, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." And that's true for all of us. Ian McCloskey, when I remember, and And what I want to remember about him was what I knew him best about, and that was his faith in God and his love of his family, and he was a fighter. And we talked about that a lot. And Ian never gave up. And one of the lessons he taught me in my life, and I'm a coach, and I teach people about things, and he taught me that it's always too soon to give up. Ian McCloskey was very complex, and we loved him. God is very complex and very complicated, and we don't always understand him either. But we love him, and we trust him, and we put our faith in him. And Ian McCloskey put his faith in God, and he fought like a warrior that I've never seen before. And I've seen some warriors. And Ian McCloskey was one of the greatest warriors I've ever seen. And he taught me that lesson that I'll never forget as I go about my days and deal with the things that I have to deal with. I think his message to you today would be, it's always too soon to give up, and keep your faith in God. Keep it where it's supposed to be. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts about Ian. He was a good man. Thank you.
Before I say something about Ian, I'd like to say something to the family. I've had 6 to 7 months here watching you, medical center. All I can say is I salute you. Jesus said that when we show sacrificial love to one another, we are demonstrating to the world that we are his disciples. And you did that magnificently. Ian believed God is faithful in spite of all that he experienced in his short lifetime. That confidence was tested, but not shaken, even with the onset of graft versus host disease following his stem cell transplant. Ian's focus remained resolutely upward and outward. And the prayer list on the whiteboards in his room spoke volumes about that focus, as he often prayed for staff and patients at the medical center. Ian lived out 2 of the paradoxes of Christianity: caring about others in the midst of extreme suffering, and the assurance that death here is but the entrance into the Lord's presence and eternal life.
I'd like to share a few things about Ian as well, but I want to make note with what an example Ian had with a family to follow. When I was over at the hospital, I've been over there a number of times, and to see Roy and Karen and his brothers and sisters, sister-in-law, brother-in-laws, it was just amazing. That everyone was always so supportive, and he drew so much strength from that. And I know Ian from in Rangers years ago. It's kind of like the Boy Scouts, only in the Assembly of God Church. I think that's where they invented the game Where's Waldo is Where's Ian. That was always our theme we had at the campouts. Where's Ian? And Patrick, of course, would check in with us, which was, Ian would say, well, I'm going, he wouldn't tell us where he's going somewhere. And of course, Patrick would come up. He learned from Ian and said, Commander Jeff, would it be okay if I could do this? And Ian, we wouldn't expect that. But Ian was a free spirit in one way, but he was I have to admit, he was complicated, but he was very genuine. I know one time I was over at Roy and Karen's place doing some work in the basement, and Ian was there. And you have to understand, at the McCloskey house, when you go back upstairs in an hour, it could be a whole new set of people in the living room. And Ian would be the first one to come down, and he said, Jeff, I just want to let you know there's a whole new set up there. And I know you got a little concerned last time you went up. But he would always be there to talk and share, and he wasn't big on small talk, but he was really big on people. And I saw the progression of him in the hospital when he first went in to when he went to be with the Lord. But I want to share with the family, because I don't think you were there when he said this. He said, you know what, if I had to go through all this to know the Lord the way I do, he said it was all worth it. He said, I'm just sorry I had to bring my family along with me with it. But I said, you have such a wonderful family, he said, I know. He said, watch out for them. And I said, well, why do you say that, Ian? He said, because he said, they're much too much for me to watch out for. He said, and I said, why is that? And he said, well, he said, I'm just busy with other things. And we would take time to pray, and he would say, we would pray, and I would take time to pray, and sometimes he would pray, and sometimes he wouldn't say anything. And but I knew from sometimes with his tears and his fervor that he would just give everything he had for the Lord. So thank you for letting me share that.
I not only want to thank you guys for your words, but those of you who spent years with Ian in the scouting program at this church, Rural Rangers, you helped shape his life. And nothing could be more valuable than shaping the life of someone. It's quite difficult to sum up a life lived well for 32 years in just a few minutes. I could take days to talk about Ian, but I'm not, because you won't be here for days. I had to look to someone who probably knows him best to give me some great insights into his life, and that's his mama. That's what he called Karen Mama. You know, I don't care who you are, your mama knows you like no one else. And maybe well, everybody else, if you're a kid trying to figure out where you're at or what you're doing, it seems like your mom always knew. No matter what trouble you got into or where you were at, mama always knew. Karen shared some things with me the other night, and I want to share them with you. And when she gave me this little note, it struck me how true these things were. She said, from birth, there was just something about that twinkle in his big brown eyes. I didn't meet Ian until I came to this church as a children's pastor in 1994. Ian, I think, was in 5th or 6th grade. And I can remember he was one of those outstanding kids, and he would just look at you, and it just kind of melt your heart. He had that kind of a look of it was just a soft, compassionate look that you don't see in many elementary kids. You would look at Ian, and no matter what he did, you just say, it's okay, Ian. Don't worry about it. It didn't cost that much that you broke it. It's okay. He was just one of those kind of kids you just couldn't get upset with sometimes. Maybe his parents did, but I couldn't get upset with him. And, I can remember, and this kind of breaks my heart a little bit. I remember my wife and I, Debbie, she's with Ian right now as well. But I can remember Ian coming into our kids' church, and something had just started going wrong, and he was starting to lose little patches of hair, and he wasn't diagnosed with what it was. And the puzzled look on his face, the innocence on his face, our hearts broke for him. And yet, he never complained. He never complained. I never heard him complain once about his situation. There was something about Ian that was just tremendous. Ian was always very curious about everything. That's probably why he would leave the camp and go somewhere and you couldn't find him. He was curious. He was a very active little boy. And it was that curiosity of things and how they worked that led him to a love of anything mechanical at a very young age. Roy told me that he received a motor scooter from a neighbor, and if you know, they lived in this little cul-de-sac, and Ian would just go out and ride that motor scooter up and down and back and forth as long as he was allowed. He loved that motor scooter. Not sure the neighbors liked him riding it up and down all the time, but he loved it. It didn't seem to bother him. And Ian and I share that love for motorcycles. I'm a motorcycle fanatic, and so is he. And I can remember all the posts he made about this motorcycle, then that motorcycle, and we communicate back and forth on Facebook talking about bikes. And he would tell me to be careful out there, Pastor George. And he's the one that has the accident. And even with the accident, it was like a badge of courage almost for Ian to tell me all the things that were broken and ripped and torn and how mangled he was. And he's in the hospital, and it didn't seem to bother him. I'm thinking, how's this guy going to survive life? It's tough enough. He's dealing with these cancers and his immune system, and now the motorcycle accident. But he came right back to get on a motorcycle again. You got to love a kid like that. He was always very positive about everything. Ian loved being in Royal Rangers. He was an outdoorsman and loved that Ranger scouting program from this church. I remember seeing him in his uniform and being at certain campouts. There he'd be. He had a sort of a nickname. He called himself the Silver Lightning Fox. I don't know what that means. I tried racking my brain ever since Karen told me that. I didn't ask the family. But I wonder why he called himself the Silver Lightning Fox. And he loved the outdoors. He loved the beauty of nature. He enjoyed creation from a tree stand. He loved watching wild animals and even shooting a few wild animals. At camp, he helped me out for a week of camp, summer camp. I run camps for kids, and Ian volunteered. As sick as he was, he volunteered to help us at camp. Our day starts at 6 and ends at about 1 in the morning. And he was a trooper. And I remember somebody coming into the gymnasium. He was working with something, and they said, "Hey, I'm at the BB gun range, and I can't get these BB rifles to work. Can somebody show me how to do it?" Before anybody could say anything, Ian was out the door and showed the person how to use them and how to operate, all the safety reasons and what they should be doing. And he just orchestrated the whole BB rifle range for me. And then he comes back in with a couple rifles. He goes, "These aren't working right, Pastor George. You got a toolbox somewhere?" And he proceeded to take them apart and put them back together. And, I admire that kind of skill and that kind of love for the outdoors. And the ones he loved most are right here in the front row. A year and a half ago, he spent a week with me at summer camp. And despite all his pain and all his weakness that he went through, he never complained. He never even asked prayer for himself. But he loved his family. Oh boy, did he ever. He would end conversations with his mom with these words, "I love you." Called Karen Mama and called Roy Pops. While at summer camp in 1 week, I think he mentioned his dad 100 times. "My dad this. My dad says this. My dad lives like this. My dad gave me this advice. My dad can do this." He loved his pops. He mentioned the word pops a few times, mostly his dad and his family. He talked about his family, how great they were. He told me if he feels sorry for anybody, he feels for his family because of all they had to go through with his sickness and his illness. And they gave and they sacrificed, and he recognized every bit of it. Ian was something else. He was something else. Roy, I don't know if you realize just how much you influenced your son. You influenced his philosophy of life, his faith, his passion for treating people the way Jesus would treat people. I look at you today, and you're one of the richest men I know. You raised your son to live for Jesus and to ensure that his final destination would be eternity with God, and it's happened. That makes you a rich man today, Roy. Ian lived out the words of Jesus. He didn't just believe it, he lived it. The Beatitudes tell us this. Jesus said, "You've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to take your tunic and sue you, let him have your coat as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." Roy and Karen, Ian was not only your son, but he was a son of the Father in heaven because he lived that out. He lived it out. Ian's life was about others, caring, loving, and serving. While volunteering at kids camp, he served about 400 boys and girls that week. Ian was quickly known by everybody there. He loved to pray for people. I never saw anybody love to pray for people so much as Ian. I understand, and I think Dave mentioned it while he was in the hospital, he had a whiteboard. He'd write down the names of hospital personnel and what their prayer needs were and pray for them. While at kids camp, we had a female chaperone. Ian was on my staff, but one of the chaperones came, and it was very easy to see that she was battling cancer as well. She had no hair. And Ian quickly saw that, went over and asked her what her situation was, because he was in the same situation, and she shared her cancer story and how desperate her life had been and how difficult it was. And that night, Ian decided to pray for her, But he knew he couldn't go over to the girls' dormitory area and pray because that just wouldn't be right. And he found a couple of staff people of mine, other staff folks, a couple girls and a couple guys. And one of the girls he found to help him go pray was a worker at the conference center where we were at. And her name was Emily. And Ian didn't know where this Sandra, who had cancer, was staying at. And he said, does anybody know where Sandra's at? And Emily goes, I know right where she's at. Well, let's go and let's pray for her. All of you go with me, okay? And they go on down to this house on the campus. And Emily goes in and says, Sandra, there's a guy out there that wants to pray for you. We all want to pray for you. Can you come out? And Sandra says, well, it's 10:30 tonight. I'm getting ready to go to bed. Well, just be a minute. Come on out. Well, Sandra was one of our housekeepers, too. It was the wrong Sandra. She puts her robe on, and she comes out, and Ian takes one look at her and says to Emily, that's the wrong Sandra. But let's pray for her anyway. Everybody needs prayer. Now, Sandra, you got to know her. I'm surprised she came out. She's one of my employees. I'm really surprised she came out. She's probably in her late 50s and kind of just quiet and just doesn't interact well with a lot of people. But she came out in her bathrobe and they prayed for her and said, what can we pray for you about? And she says, well, my mother's going through a very difficult time right now. Very, very difficult. So Ian, he prayed for her and everybody else prayed. And after they're done, he says, let's go try to find the other Sandra, okay? And they finally tracked her down and she came out of the cabin and they prayed for her as well. But Ian, I don't ever remember that whole week him ever asking me to pray for him. I remember being in the worship services with all these kids jumping and screaming and worshiping, and there was Ian right with them praying and going around laying hands on different boys, praying for them. And I'm standing there and he comes up and he prays for me. But he never asked for prayer for himself, from us. I think he had a great idea and a great concept of God's will. And whatever it was, he was up for it. Didn't make a difference. Ian was that kind of guy. That's who Ian was. They gave me, the family, a message that Ian shared in a church service. And I want to read part of it. His message starts off like this. These are his words from handwritten text. How many of you have experienced or known someone who has experienced hardship, such as a cancer, car accident, a house on fire, people affected by a flood, or a loss of a family member, or loss of a job, or broken bones, or divorce, or maybe someone who's been abused, or some disability, or some learning disorder, maybe bankruptcy? He said everyone suffers from a hardship. Trusting in God in all situations strengthens our faith. We have to give God a chance to use our suffering to show others Christ-like character. Ian lived that out. He battled cancer for about 18 to 19 years, and he won the battle. You see, dying doesn't lose the battle. Having faith in Christ and going triumphantly to the next dimension of heaven wins the battle. As we were at camp, we talked about my wife, who passed away about 4 years ago with cancer as well. And I shared with Ian all the stories of Deb and what she went through and how bravely she embraced Jesus in heaven. And I could just see somehow, some way his eyes lit up. I don't know what he was thinking. He never told me. But I know he wanted to be that kind of a person, and he was. He lived it out. Romans 5 tells us this. We also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character, hope. And hope will not disappoint us. I shared that with Ian because I lived that for 4.5 years as my wife battled cancer. And it's so true. That suffering produced a perseverance that young man hung on to. He wouldn't let go of what God had for him. He knew there was a better life and a better place, and every day was going to get better. And he hung on to that. And that perseverance produced a Christ-like character in him that has touched hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. And that character, that Christ-like character, has hope. When everything else seems like it's going to disappoint us, it has hope. And Ian had hope. And he knows that hope does not disappoint us. Ian was someone who touched thousands of lives. You can go on his Facebook page and you can scroll, and I did for about an hour and a half yesterday. And I got tired of scrolling because I couldn't get back more than just a couple months because everybody on there was talking about Ian touching his life. And Ian touched my life. And Ian did this. And Ian did that. And Ian was a stand-up guy. And he was my best friend. I didn't know somebody could have so many best friends. But it's a legacy that he left of lives touched. That's who Ian was. That's who Ian was. Hope does not disappoint us. Ian's family would like to come up and share some words with you this morning about their sibling brother and their son. Yes.
We decided to talk a little bit about Ian's incredible qualities. One thing I loved about Ian was his compassion. Since he was diagnosed at an earlier age, he understood a lot of things. He understood what it meant to be an outcast from the misfortune of his disease, from his being bald. In an era of what I deem people to have convenient compassion and selective sympathy, Ian didn't have that. His compassion kind of drove you nuts a little bit because he would have compassion over people that truly needed it. And you'd say, oh, but, why do we have to go out of our way to do this, brother? And he said, they need it. They need it. He reached out to people that went through similar trials in their lives and those that truly needed it. And he listened and he gave them advice. Ian also understood what it meant to be broken. He rightfully and understandably had been very angry and bitter about his diagnosis as a teen and struggled with understanding God's plan and purpose, as we all do. But in the last 5 years, Ian made a major transformation and rededicated himself to the Lord. He surrendered fully to God, and he didn't look back. Many of you are witnesses to this transformation, and if you only knew Ian as a kid when he knew the Lord, this was just an extension of that. But it just became so much more. Sure, he had his moments of frustration as he and at his current suffering, as expected, but he just trusted. He trusted Jesus. Ian had peace that I had never seen before. You could see it in his eyes. You could hear it in his voice. You could see it in his actions and in his passion for studying Scripture. His heart changed, and it was evident. If you would like to honor Ian, I'm begging you, please surrender yourself and your bitterness and your anger about Ian's death to Christ. If Ian could surrender with all his suffering and could trust God and its outcome, then certainly we can too. He loved you all, and he wanted each and every one of you to find the Lord and surrender as well. And I believe that's what he was fighting for. I think that a lot of people in their last days are selfishly fighting to live out in a way. They just want to live, I think Ian was trying to live for the rest of us. Ian was the best man at my wedding. Can't thank him enough for that. He always made time for many of us, and he was also very selfless. He worked on our cars, a lot of our cars in his free time. And I can guarantee you a lot of people here have had Ian either diagnose or fix or at least look at a car. He always told me he was out, working out or whatever, and somebody would say, hey, there's something wrong with my car. And Ian would always make time to go out and look at their car and use his talents. And God gave him a specific set of mechanical talents that he used for God. And I considered him a missionary mechanic. He showed the love of Christ in just the simple act of fixing cars. He was just so selfless in that way. The funny thing is, when Ian recovered from his bone marrow transplant, he said he wanted to start his own ministry. But I look around today, and what he had overlooked was that he already had his own ministry. It may have not been an official nonprofit like maybe he envisioned, but it was an unofficial ministry that was incredibly impactful and touched so many lives. We need to make sure we pass that ministry along and honor him by living selflessly and showing compassion over those who truly need it. I'll end with this. Ian brought me a lot of peace and comfort in the last couple weeks. I think he was always my protector. And even the last day, this third to last day of his life, and things weren't looking good, he always protected me from his diagnosis and his prognosis. And this was so Ian, was when I walked in the room after we had gotten the call to come quickly, because it could only be a couple hours. And in true Ian fashion, it was a couple days, because he's just a fighter. But we were told to come quickly, and when I came in the room about 7 or 8 in the morning, Ian looked over and they said, "Patrick's here." And he immediately ripped off his oxygen and he said, "Hey man, what's going on? What's up?" And he just protected me until the end. He didn't want me to know the fears and the suffering and the sorrow. But I'll end with this. Don't be fooled by the pleasantries and the language that is commonplace surrounding death and at funerals. The reason my family finds comfort that Ian is walking and talking and praising the Lord up there is because he walked and he talked and he praised the Lord down here. There's no other way around that. He loves you all, and he wants you all to join him in eternity. So honor him by surrendering your life to Christ.
There's a lot that I could say about my big brother. As wild and crazy and adventurous as he always was, he was always gentle with me. And he treated me like gold. And we had a special bond. One of the things I loved about Ian was that him and Patrick, nobody could make me laugh like they could. And they loved making me laugh. And I know that when I see him again, the first thing he's going to want to do is make me giggle, because it brought him so much joy. When Ian underwent the bone marrow transplant, he had sought God out and had decided that it was time to agree to do the bone marrow transplant. And he knew that it was a huge risk. But he had peace about it, because he told us that no matter what happened, whether he lived or he died, that God was going to be glorified. That's a pretty powerful statement to make when you're facing death at the time he was 31. And the other statement he made that I think is also something people need to know, and he made this statement on more than one occasion, it was somewhat mentioned before, but he stated that if his cancer is what it took for him to know God the way he did, then he wouldn't take it back. And I really want to let that sink in. He truly wanted everyone to know God the way that he does, and he did. And he ministered to people. When he went in for the bone marrow transplant, and some of you might not really know the ins and outs of all that, but it's an extremely difficult process. And they basically wipe you clean so that they can put new cells in. And that takes a huge toll on somebody's body. But Ian, in his true fashion, pushed himself to do what he believed Jesus would have done and what he believed Jesus wanted him to do. And he would ask nurses if they had prayer requests. And he would go out into the halls if he felt well enough, and he would talk to people randomly. And before you know it, they would be on the prayer list, or he would pray with them. And before we left the hospital, he made me write down the list that was on the board at the time. Some of them were added at the very last minute on our way out the door. And that night at home, he sat us all down, and he went through every single person on this list. I think we might have prayed for an hour, or at least it felt like it. But Ian truly lived the way that God commands us. And that is why we have so much peace. Of course, we wish we had more time with him here, and we will miss him every single day of our lives until God calls us home. But we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ian is with Jesus and that we will see him. And the most important thing that he would want you to know is that if you don't know God, if you don't know Christ and you don't love Christ the way that Ian did, he wants that for you. He wants that for everyone. And I'll end with that.
I'm Ian's older sister, and having been on this earth nearly 4 years before Ian came, I can tell you, I can fill you in on some of the early details. Before he came, I spent a good bit of time drawing a straight line like oldest children do. And then Ian came along, and he wasn't really interested in drawing straight lines. He liked to have too much fun. He was this little wild, brown-eyed, dimpled boy, and he just pushed all kinds of limits from the beginning. He was the toddler poking scissors in the electrical outlets and taking things apart before he knew how to put them back together. And once he locked several doors. One time he locked us all in my parents' bedroom while we were getting ready for church, and my dad actually had to climb over the roof because Ian wouldn't unlock the door. And I don't blame him, I really don't. My dad was pretty angry at that point. There was a little scuffle on the other side of the door in the hallway. It was just, those were some of the things that he did, and he did them more than once. So, he loved anything mechanical from the beginning. And Don DiAgostino, who's doing the sound tonight, today, he made this amazing toy for Ian that I will never forget because it was the coolest toy I've ever seen. It had all these switches and levers and buttons, and it lit things up. And I wanted that toy. It was very cool. Ian knew how to push buttons that way, and also he was a little antagonist. He was good at, that's his job as my little brother, was to kind of push those buttons. He knew how to do that. He did a good job of shaking things up. And, he was complex. That's like Dan said, I really appreciate that because we all are. We're all complex. He just had a lot of energy, and one story my parents always tell is that he would come home from church and he would just be bouncing off the walls. And they didn't know why for the longest time, and then they realized he always had a red mustache after church, and it was because he kept drinking red Kool-Aid there, and sugar always wound Ian up, so he was pretty wound up after he drank that. And he always loved sugar into adulthood. He had his favorite candies, and they had pretty much the same effect on him, so he always had so much energy in that body. And we played together a lot when we were little. I probably kept playing with him till I was in my teens. We would all do make-believe, and my parents were a little disturbed by the fact that most of the stories we made up, we became orphans very quickly. And we're on our own, and that made me in charge, so that really worked out for me. And then Ian was, we were talking about this the other day, he was always such a great sport, and he would just do whatever I asked. And usually did something very adventurous as part of the story. And that was, it was true of everything for Ian, that everything he liked, he kind of threw himself into. He poured himself into that. He was far too curious to follow all the rules, yet he was extremely sensitive. Maybe not everybody knew that about him because he was a tough guy too, but I knew that about him as his older sister. So that combination of things made me worry for him. That combination of recklessness and sensitivity. I never trusted that motorcycle, but I knew if I told him don't ride motorcycles, he'd go out and buy 2 more, so I kept that to myself. And most of you know he was incredibly charming, which I always found crazy because his charm didn't work as much on me as being a sibling, but he wasn't trying to get anything from it, but people would give him things that just perfect strangers. He came home with the biggest TV I've ever seen. And, but he was very generous and he would have done the same thing for others, so. But ultimately, that recklessness and that uncontainable energy that I considered sometimes to be such a liability, God used those things to teach Ian and to teach us. The reason I know is because I watched him be transformed over this last decade in particular into a man who channeled that recklessness into love. He loved recklessly. He didn't consider the cost of his love for others, to himself. He just loved. One example of that is in the first month after his transplant, he was neutropenic, which means his immune system was so low that he could not be around anybody that had any kind of virus or could potentially kill him. And I was visiting with him, and he told me that he had prayed with this woman that he didn't realize had a virus until after he was praying with her. She was in the hospital, probably for something similar as he was. And he couldn't leave the room even though he realized that she had a virus. He wouldn't leave because he didn't think that was right and he needed to stay and pray with her. And of course I was worried for him and he told me not to worry. And I thought that was so admirable that he did that. When you love recklessly like Ian did, you risk it all. And he risked his life to pray for her. In the end, love is a choice, and it's sometimes a painful one. Ian's reckless love was such a testament to the love of Jesus Christ, who loves us without condition, and who doesn't count the cost, because he gave it all for us. I think, not that I would ever want my brother to suffer the way he did, but I saw that suffering produce such an intimacy with God that I don't think many of us will ever know, because Jesus suffered so much on our behalf and saw a lot of similarities. One of my favorite recent moments with Ian happened when we were visiting him in his hospital room a few months ago. He always knew how to entertain Jude, who's my son, and he's going to be 4. And we'd bring Jude in, and Ian had a pain pump that had a button on it, and it would light up when he could push it again for medicine, and he would let Jude push the button. And he would let Jude ride on his bed. A doctor came in one time worried Jude was going to fall off and break his arm. And we all laughed, well, he's in the right place, so if he has to go to the ER, that's okay. But, he knew how to make Jude happy even in the hospital, and it made the hospital a fun place for Jude. And I know Ian did that when he was in a lot of pain. And the movement probably made him more nauseous, or maybe gave him pain. And I know that was a sacrifice for him. And I know he probably wished he could be throwing Jude in the air and doing all the things that he could do when he was healthier. But that time, Jude was sitting on his bed, and he likes to sing the Lord's Prayer, his new thing. And he sang it for Ian. And when he got to the part, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever, amen," he gave it this great crescendo. And Ian broke into this smile that he couldn't help himself. He thought Jude was so cute, but I think he also loved that Jude was singing about the Lord. And I think the combination of those things was really special to Ian. He loved Jude, and he loved that Jude was praising God the way we were created to do. So I think, just to close, I want to say, I'm sorry I keep sniffling. There's no tissues up here. Grieving is a process, and even though we know he's with the Lord, I feel it's okay to be sad and mourn, and it's going to be a process in accepting that Ian's physical body is not here with us anymore. But it could also be easy to become bitter and angry, and like Patrick said, I don't think holding on to that for very long is going to be honoring Ian. Because even at the end of Ian's journey and struggle with his difficult diagnosis, he did not choose bitterness, and neither should we. As Patrick said, he chose the path of surrender. He knew if he loved God, he had to trust him no matter what. And he also knew that bitterness and love cannot coexist. For Ian, love was the most important thing. He wanted all of us to know that we are deeply and recklessly loved by God. And I know that he would want us to carry on that strong conviction, sharing the reckless love of Jesus with others. It doesn't seem this way sometimes, but for Ian, love won. And love will continue to win if we let it. So I imagine with each act of love that we carry out after today, Ian will break into that dimpled grin we loved so much.
I mean, you came, and I'm so honored that you thought so much of my son to share this day with us. I'll start by telling you, I like public speaking about as much as I like having my thumb hit with a hammer. But this I'll do for my son, and it's important. I want to sort of start off talking a little bit about, I'll be honest, when this all started, Ian prayed long and hard, and he talked to me as his dad. We had a good relationship, and I was grateful for that. He struggled for a while, because when you're told at the age of 14, 15, 16, things don't look good, you probably won't live a long life. It creates some struggles for you. And for a little while, one of the struggles it created for Ian was that recklessness they talked to you about in his love for people. For a little while, it was just plain recklessness. And when you're his father, you don't want him to do something silly and hurt himself for no good reason. So we struggled for a bit. And we actually sought some counseling because we wanted to try to understand each other better. And he had some broken relationships and other things that hurt his heart. And over time, about the age of 24, he looked at me one day and he said, "Dad, I get it now. You've been here for me the whole time. You love me completely, and you want only the best for me." And from that point forward, my son and I had a wonderful relationship. We did as much as we could together, and he saw to it. He saw to it that we did. As a matter of fact, Ian, if our family will tell you anything, Ian was the catalyst to any party that you could have. I'm not talking about worldly parties. I'm talking about barbecues at the house. He would find any reason in the world for our family to get together. Sometimes to the point where we actually are like, oh, Ian, it's been a long weekend. He'd say, hey, our brother-in-law Anthony's home, Sam's off work, we're going to get together. And I'm grateful to him for that. It pushed us as a family to spend even more time together, and we're a pretty close family. But, I guess where I'm going with all that is Ian, over time, started teaching me as his father some important things. And when the time came for the transplant, Ian prayed hard about it. And he took me aside, just alone, the two of us, and he said, Dad, because I prayed about it, because it's in my spirit I'm going to make it here, but I don't know for sure. And if I don't, I went either way, and I do not want you to forget that. And I didn't. And many of you have commented on Ian being a warrior. I'm going to tell you, I have a father that I want to extend my thank you to. He's 80 years old. He served this nation, and he's a wonderful father to me. He's still here with me today. He set an example for me when people talk about the McCloskeys being close and loving each other. He showed me that a father is always there for his son. He took me hunting when he didn't like to hunt because it was cold and miserable. And he thought fishing was a lazy man's sport, but he took me anyhow. And my dad set the example of loving his children and loving his grandchildren. He's been here with me through this whole battle, and I want to acknowledge him for that because of the example he set. He came to know the Lord when he was young, but he came out of a very tough and hard family, and knowing the Lord for him, he had to have the Lord teach him things on his own. He didn't have examples. I want to thank him for that. And I'm not big on sports analogies. I think they're pathetic, especially when you talk about days like today. I'm going to use this one because it'll give you a chuckle, and it'll also, I'm going to tell you that Ian took this analogy to the highest level anyone could ever take. I wrestled unlimited in high school. I think I have two friends here that remember that. They had one, Mitchells are here, and my parent. Muncie was a small school. I wasn't the best athlete, was a little better than some of the guys. But back at that time, it was unlimited. I was a guy who weighed 185 pounds. So I didn't, some of my foes were pretty big guys because there was no limit on their weight. Some of them were big guys that weren't real strong, and I could muscle them a little bit. But one day I drew this guy that he was from coal country. Somebody said he was a champion, district champion. And I'm not kidding you, friends. I'm not exaggerating. It was David and Goliath. And I took one look at this guy, and I thought, this is going to be bad. And my father, who was always faithful, he called me over. He always came to the matches no matter what. And I'm thinking, hey, Dad, what are you going to tell me? There's no magic formula here. And Dad called me over and he said, son, you can't always win, but you can deny your opponent the pleasure of pitting you. I took it to heart. I lost 17-3. They didn't have mercy rules back then. I was running for my life. But Ian took that analogy, that lesson, and I told Ian that story over the years. And I'm going to tell you, the way he battled cancer, oh man. I was honored to be his father. 3 times they told him he wasn't going to make it. He's 30-some years old. They told him that in front of him. They didn't just tell us. And each time it was like a hiccup for him. The last time it happened was a few weeks ago. And he called me at work on a Friday. He said, "Dad, you're telling me my liver's going to fail." I was brokenhearted. And Ian said, "I don't want to talk about it right now, Dad. We'll talk about it when you get here." I left work. My work had been very generous about this. They've known about Ian's plate over the years. When I got to the hospital, I don't think we talked about it for more than a minute or two. He said, "Dad, whatever it is, we're just going to do the next thing." You know? And that's how he faced this whole thing. And it was a dichotomy because he fought it to his last breath. He didn't slip into a coma. He fought it, and he fought it hard. And it was painful to watch. But I know where my son is. I know he loves the Lord. And like every last one of my children just said, I know what he wanted for you. I haven't always been the kind of Christian I should be. I try, I fail. I get upset. I use salty language when I'm upset. Recently, my own son told me to, perfectly based scripture verse when I came to the hospital one day and was just worn out. I don't know why. There's a couple of things that are going wrong in recent weeks. We had a really busy season. And I said, I'm just tired and irritated. And he said, "Dad, you're not working for anybody but the Lord. Remember that." I guess where I'm trying to go with all this is, Ian taught us all so much. And none of us are perfect. One of the things that humbled me throughout this whole process, I don't think I'm a real judgmental guy, but we all have judgment in us at some point or time, And I put up a prayer request. And some of the people that were the wildest people in high school that, you didn't think cared much about things of the Lord were the first ones to say, "I'm praying for you. I'm there for you." And my son and I, our entire family, my dad kind of raised me this way. And we have I'll call it we don't bow to authority just because they're authority. We like to respect them because they earn respect. And two of our favorite people in ministry, one is gone, Rich Mullins, who wrote Awesome God, and devoted his life to helping children on Indian reservation land. And we got a book that Ian would want you to have. And if you all can't get it, please find a way to get a hold of us. Email us, text us, Facebook us. We'll find a way to get one to everybody. But it's by Francis Chan. And again, it's about salvation and about selling yourself out to God. I haven't lived a perfect life, but I don't regret 1 minute that I've given my family to God. And I'm proud of them today. I'm proud of them that they all got up here and had the same message from the same brother. And if you leave here today, yeah, I'm sad. When Ian told me God would be glorified, I kind of hoped it would be through miraculous healing. That'd be a lot easier as a dad. But I know God can be glorified through the example Ian set to so many of you, and I want that to happen. In closing, I'm going to tell you a couple quick stories and read two Bible verses. One of the things that Ian had in his heart, Pastor George touched on it. He had a tender spirit. you know, he had a tender spirit. And, you know, you go through those times in life when you're a parent, just getting to church and getting home is an accomplishment. Right, Pastor George? But one day, we moved into our neighborhood where Ian was living at 106 Linden Drive up till the point he got too sick. And we lived in that house for most of the children's lifetimes. It was a few years here on the East Shore, but not many. Ian, we're on our way home one day from Christian Life Assembly. And Christian Life Assembly had, you know, hundreds of cars leave here at the same time. And I drove down to Slate Hill Road and I made a turn onto Hartsdale. And out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed and I saw a minivan, but I didn't really catch who was there. And I was just a father that was worn out. And so I start driving down Hartsdale Drive and Ian says to me, "Dad, I think that was Mr. Navigado." Now, Frank Navigado welcomed us to our neighborhood like the kings welcomed Jesus. I mean, he was a wonderful man, kind and loving, and giving my children gifts and just came to visit them and talk to them. In fact, one day he did a Russian dance at 80 years of age. He was able to dance lower than I could. And but anyhow, we got almost to the house, and I'm kind of like, I said to Ian, "You know, Ian, maybe it wasn't Mr. Navigado. I'm tired, I need to take a nap." And Ian's like, "Dad, you got to go back." And the closer we got to the house, and the more I said, "Ian, somebody else will stop." You know, I'm ashamed of myself for saying this, but, you know, I thought, well, there's 200 more cars, somebody else will stop. He goes, "Dad, you have to go back." Before he was done, he started crying. So what does the father say? I turned the car around, we went back, and it was Frank Navigado. I don't remember if we gave him a jump start or brought him home, but he was thrilled. And pulling forward here to the age of 30, 31, my father blessed us with helping us a little bit financially. I wanted Ian to have some fun before he had to go through this transplant. So we went, you'll forgive me, any of you that are total animal lovers, but we went to Georgia to go hog hunting. And these were real hogs. These weren't the ones they put in pens, and these were tearing up farmers' fields. And I wanted to make it a really cool experience. So I found this guy that did it with night vision, like the Navy SEALs use, $6,000, $7,000 scopes. And I knew that would thrill Ian because he loved everything military. And so we went, we hunted. We both managed to hit one, but didn't bring him home. We had a great time because Ian was off of chemo for just enough time to feel good enough to eat. So on the trip, he had two kinds of fun. Fun making fun of his father because I was exhausted, and then the trip was, you know, everything had just been rushed that summer. So I laid down in the back of our Sorrento, our Kia Sorrento, on an air pad, and I passed out, and he drove us all the way to Georgia and took pictures as we went through each state of me sleeping. And but we got there and we hunted, and he ate like a king. We ate soul food at one place and we ate steaks at another, and he was happier than he'd been in ages as far as having an appetite. But on the way home, we got around DC. Traffic's crazy. You guys are going to see where this is going again. Traffic is just nuts. You know how DC gets on the Beltway at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And Ian and I don't remember which one of us was driving. It might have been. But we see this guy sitting in a Subaru Forester with steam rolling out. And of course, it's so tight you're worried about if you pull off the road, you might get hit, you know. And Ian goes, "Dad, that guy's in trouble." Okay, Ian. Learn by now not to argue, you know. But we pulled over, and another man, kind of a gregarious man, he was a black man about my build, and he had got out of a car. he and Ian started talking, and I knew immediately they were mechanical brothers, because they were both mechanics, and they dug in their toolboxes and they repaired the car. They got the guy's car so it wasn't overheating. It was pushing the fluid where it needed to go. And we came on home. But I'm going to read the scripture to you now. Two things that came to our family. One of them, we struggled with because we watched Ian fight this so hard. And I'm telling you, like I said, he was a warrior. When I talk about him taking that analogy my father gave me, man, my son-in-law is sitting down here. He's a Riverine. Closest the Navy comes to infantry. He's convinced that Ian could have been in Special Forces. He doesn't think anybody could have tortured anything out of that man. Because he watched him fight tooth and nail. And he did not yield 1 inch to that disease. He won. He wanted to be home with his father, and he didn't let the disease pound him. He showed it who was boss. But we take solace in the verses that say, in Psalms 139, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Ian definitely shared in the suffering, and I believe he's sharing in the glory. And his hope for you is to look where you're at in life. Don't make it complicated. Yield your life to Christ. When Christ tells you what to do, do the right thing. Like I said, we're big fans of Rich Mullins, and one of the things Ian got to do while he was still sick, his sister and I and him went to watch the movie they made about his life, which they kind of had to push his family to do. But at the end of the movie, his spiritual mentor, Brendan, I think his name was Brendan Manning, they closed the movie with this simple statement. Brendan Manning talks about how complicated we make things in a church. We bicker over baptism, silly things, for those of us that know the church. Not that doctrinal things don't have relativity, but before we save somebody, we don't need to be talking about the ridiculous things, because there's one simple message. Brendan Manning said, when you step into God's presence, he's really going to have one thing to say to you. Do you believe I loved you? Did you really believe I loved you? Meaning he loved you enough to send his son, Jesus Christ, to die for you and to change your life. And our society needs to stop living a selfish life, and we need to put Christ first. And we need to take days like this, and they're not just memories of sadness. I feel bad for that family, because we're going to get through this. Thanks to Ian, thanks to what he left us, thanks to our faith. What God wants from you is to change if you need to change, and to hear him, and to yield to him. Nothing more, nothing less. The last thing I'm going to read is from Ian, just to show you the kind of spirit he had going through this. This was September 13th. This was after he got out of the hospital. And I don't know if this is right before or right, I think this might have been right before the graft versus host struck and he had to be readmitted. He was so sick to his stomach. He had this on his Facebook. He said, today, I feel blessed. I'll add, my mom and dad came down to help take care of him after he got out that week. He said, today, I feel blessed. I'm relaxing, watching football with my grandfather. And I'm realizing that it's not necessarily my position or place in this world that makes me special. But it is the fact that we all have different perspectives.
that make life interesting and enjoyable. Many can grow in the same family or under the same teachings or parents, but it is up to us as individuals to develop our own sense of reality, which definitely makes the, quote, perception is reality statement very truthful at this moment. Life can hand you lemons, but lemonade is not the only positive outcome. If you can appreciate the lemon for what it is, it can be a blessing in many different situations. I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people think if they were in my shoes, life would be extremely difficult. And at times it is, but I also want all of you to know that my time here is just as valuable as anyone else, and that we all must develop our own kind of glasses to wear to be able to have a perspective that not only encourages others, but keeps them fighting for a better perspective. Because if you can't see life as fulfilling and fruitful, it will be hard for anyone else to. Happiness starts with you. Love, Ian. Sometimes I write posts to remind myself, but if you enjoy it, that's great too. Thank you all.